Welcome to the Mobility Talks. You are watching episode 19 of your favorite web series by EIT, Urban Mobility. And today we are discussing the role of price incentives in urban mobility. To get us started, I'd like to kick off with a question for you. What percentage of the operational costs of public transport do you think is covered by subsidies on average in European cities? So you can visit the Slido tab in the chat box and send us your answer. We'll be checking that as we go through. Now, urban mobility is not any kind of market, whether it is privatized, outsourced, or directly managed by a public authority. It remains first and foremost a public service that interacts with many individual options, such as the private car, but also walking, cycling, and newer forms of personalized mobility that we see on our streets, such as scooters and weird pedestrians on wheels. I'm still not quite sure what you call those. And increasingly, there are also shared mobility services, which effectively create a form of on-demand, collectivized transport. But whereas consumers may consider price as a decision-making factor between competing brands within a product category, when it comes to urban mobility, it's more of a competition between categories rather than within. And the question then becomes, can I satisfy all my mobility needs within a single category? For instance, a shared bicycle system. Or do I need to combine multiple categories? Shared bicycles, but also then using public transport, maybe walking, or dare I say, having a private car. And from a public policy perspective, considering the big picture of urban mobility, what can be done to ensure the public service of urban mobility, and how can I set up a pricing and incentive system that accompanies behavior change and helps achieve my objectives in terms of CO2 emission reduction or eliminating congestion and creating just more generally livable public spaces. So to discuss these issues, we will first hear from a new study in the making on micro-incentives, a tool to nudge behavior towards sustainable mobility in Europe. And then we will have a panel discussion bringing in the perspective of two major European cities, London and Sofia, as well as a mobility company. So let's see what the audience is saying in terms of their answers to our poll question. I will now reveal the results. Let's see now, show results. So we have more than 50%. So people consider that more than 50% of operational costs of public transport are covered by subsidies on average in European cities, more than 50%. So that's what the audience considers. Now, is this a good estimate? And what else can we learn about pricing and incentives for sustainable mobility? Well, to present the preliminary findings of the study on micro-incentives, I am joined by its two co-authors, Pietro Podesta and Miquel Nadal. Pietro is a mobility consultant with Factual, and Miquel is an external advisor. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining.
Hello, pleasure to be with you.
Welcome, everyone.
So, can you help us then? Can you reveal what the correct answer is, and maybe give us some insights on this study in the making?
Okay, great. I'm going to start with the presentation then. First of all, of course, let me thank you for giving us the opportunity to present a study that, as you said, is in the making. We've been working on it for some months now, but it's not finished yet. And what we will be doing today is presenting the preliminary findings. I will present some initial findings for 7 or 8 minutes, and then Pietro will take over, and also he will present the results of some surveys that we have been conducting in two cities, Madrid and Barcelona, but there are other cities that will come. Okay, as the slide shows, sorry, Pietro, here. What we want to present is a study on what we call micro-incentives for sustainable mobility in Europe. I will elaborate a bit more on the concept of micro-incentives, but for the moment, let me say that when we talk about micro-incentives, we are talking basically about more targeted incentives for mobility and especially for public transport. Before I go into the results, into the initial result of this study, let me make 3 initial points. First, with this study, we don't want to come to final solutions on or to final conclusions on the issue. Okay, what we want is first to put the issue of microincentives on the table, to have an open discussion on the issue, to see whether there is agreement that this can be an interesting idea. Secondly, we want to see if or what scope is there for its eventual implementation. Okay, and the third thing that I want to say also is that I think that this study comes at a timely moment because what we are seeing in some European countries, especially during COVID and after COVID, is that some governments are thinking on the possibility to increase subsidies very much to public transport and to eventually make it free or almost free. And in this sense, we think that micro-subsidies, this concept of micro-subsidies that we are proposing, can be somehow an intermediate solution between the situation that we have now and a scenario where we would eventually go to free public transport, which would mean that everyone would pay a price zero for public transport, which is, as we can all understand, an unsustainable situation, especially for many PAs. Having said this, Pietro, if we can move to the first slide. Let me just say as a formality that this is a study that is being conducted by Factual, but there are some partners also that are supporting the study. We have some mobile institutions like EIT or Carnet, a mobile institution here in Barcelona. We have some PTAs that are supporting the study from Tartu, from Leuven, and from Hasselt. And also we have some MSPs that are also part of the study like Caros, MIP, Fertig, or Keita. Okay. Now, very quickly, why do we think that we need to think subsidization? And here I go into a more conceptual explanation. Okay, it's clear that subsidies from an economic point of view are justified on 2 grounds. First, there is an equity or a fairness issue. If you want, there is a need to facilitate access to mobility to certain groups of users to go to work, to go to study, to go wherever. Okay, but also, as has been said in the introduction, subsidies are justified on the ground of efficiency or on the need to reduce the externalities of basically private mode of transport and of the car, especially the private car, especially that generates congestion or CO2 emissions or air pollution that lowers the air quality in cities. So this is well established. Okay, nonetheless. Going over the literature, over the existing literature, what we see is that subsidies, the way they are designed now in many cities, can be an effective way to achieve these 2 goals of fairness and reduction of externalities, but often they are not an efficient way of doing it, in the sense that some groups of users may need larger subsidies than they actually get, or other groups of users are being subsidized when there is no need to subsidize them. Okay, so somehow what we have is a suboptimal use of public resources. And what we find out also is that reduced fares can succeed in decreasing the use of private motorized transport, of the private car especially, but this depends highly on a case-by-case basis. So basically what this suggests, in our view, is that if we were able to be more granular, to have more targeted subsidies, probably this could be quite interesting, especially if we would somehow apply these subsidies not only to public transport, but also open it to applying it to other modes of transport, independent whether they are operated by a public operator or not. No? Next slide, please. Pietro. Okay, here, I mean, these results that come from the literature basically what they reflect is what basic economics tell us, and this is what we have tried to reflect in this graph, where we analyze the impact of different forms of subsidies, whether they are uniform or targeted subsidies or micro subsidies. What we see in this graph, what we have is a curve, a demand curve for public transport, okay, and also a supply curve that we assume that is flat, that it is horizontal, okay. When there are no subsidies, we are in point A, okay, with a number of users, X0 and P0. Now imagine that for whatever reason we decide that we want to increase the number of users, and we want to achieve a number of users that is X1. Okay, so in this case we need to move to point 2 in the graph. To move to point 2, we have several options. One is to give a uniform subsidy. This means that all the users, all the X1 users would be getting the same subsidy. This means that the amount of subsidies that would be dispersed would be A plus B plus C. So this is quite a large amount. We could have an alternative solution where we could have a targeted subsidy, in the sense that the subsidy would go only from the users from X0 to X1. So, and the users from 0 to X0 would be paying the P0 price. Okay. In this case, the amount of subsidies that we would need to disperse would be B plus C. So we would be saving A, which is a big amount, because there are many users that do not need subsidies in order to have access to public transport. So from an efficiency point of view in the use of public resources, clearly targeted subsidies seem to be more optimal. But still, they are not fully optimal, because there is a third option, which is the one that somehow we are putting on the table, that we would call the micro subsidies option, where the users between X0 and X1 would be getting a subsidy, but not all users would be getting the same subsidy. In this case, we could have an optimal scenario where the cost or the amount of subsidies that we need to disperse would be only C. So we would be getting the same result, moving from point 1 to point 2, but with much lesser needs of public resources. And this is basically the concept that lies behind micro subsidies. And of course, this is not a new concept. I mean, this is basically price discrimination, perfect price discrimination, but from the point of view of subsidies. So it would be perfect subsidy discrimination if you want. So with this concept in mind, we define micro subsidies. Next slide, Pietro, please. As very narrowly targeted subsidies. So subsidies down to the level, as I said, of very narrowly defined categories, or even individual users, that can be modulated according to different categorical or personal characteristics, age, income, disability, whatever we want, or any relevant feature of the journey, like time, geolocation, mode of transport, type of motorization, occupancy, and so on and so forth. In principle, the concept of micro subsidies, I think, is quite straightforward, but in practice, there are three caveats that apply. Pietro, please, next slide. And I think it's important to keep them in mind, because the practicalities in applying micro subsidies are the key. Okay. The first point we want to make is that when we think of micro subsidies, this is not a black or white issue. There are subsidies already in place in most countries and in most cities. There are targeted subsidies in place already, so this is not new. Okay, but somehow with micro subsidies, what we think is that we may be opening the door to having a more surgical approach to subsidy policy, with the aim of maximizing the impact of subsidies, so the goals that we want to achieve with subsidies, and also maximizing or optimizing the use of public resources. The second caveat that we need to take into account is the issue of complexity versus simplicity. in principle, micro-subsidies imply a more complex structure, a more complex fare structure, or a more complex subsidy structure. Okay, and this is an important issue from the point of view of PTAs, because complex fare structures or complex subsidy structures are more difficult or more complex to manage, and also probably it makes the forecasting of income less easy to the PTAs. And finally, there's a third point that also is important to take into account, which is the efficiency versus fairness issue. Okay, we know, as I have tried to show before, that micro-subsidies are an efficient solution, but this does not imply that this is a fair solution. Okay, because with micro-subsidies, we might be putting in place some subsidies that, from the point of view of fairness, are not optimal. Okay, next slide, please, Pietro. Now, very quickly, here what we have included is 3 slides on what's the current situation of subsidies in 16, I think it is, European cities. Let me say that this information comes from EMTA, and we are very grateful to EMTA for giving us access to this information from their barometer. I should say it's a very rich information. I should say also that sometimes it's an information that it has some consistency issues, and so this means that what we have, the information that we have, we are not fully sure that it is exact information or that is homogeneous information that allows for comparisons. Nonetheless, here I will present some of the analysis that we have performed. It includes especially the City of London. So I hope that the information that we have from EMTA is correct. Otherwise, I hope that the representative from the City of London will let us know. Okay, here we have basically the basic distribution of the revenue structure of, as I said before, 16 PTAs of 16 cities between 2013 and 2020. What we see is that subsidies on average account for around 40% or 39% at the beginning of the period. This goes down to 31%, and during COVID, as expected, it increases. Okay, we have that the main source of revenue for the PTAs that we have been analyzing comes from sales. And then there is other revenue that changes in each case, and I won't go into that. That amounts for a portion between 17 and 20% of the revenue. It can be striking, it can be surprising, the fact that during this period, 2013 to 2019, which is the period of the post-financial crisis, apparently the weight of the proportion of subsidies has gone down in the cities that we have analyzed. But as we'll tell now, this is due to a very specific issue that has to do with we understand that has happened in London. This is the picture of the revenue structure of the different PTAs that we have analyzed in 2019. The only thing I want to say is that you can see that the evolution, the structure is very different. So there is not a common pattern for European cities in terms of the weight that subsidies or that sales have on the revenue structure. We see, for example, the case of London, where it amounts to 11%. Subsidies amount to only 11% of the total revenue, or in contrast to that, Prague, where they amount to over 80%. If we look at the evolution in time, next slide, please, Pietro. what we see is that in terms of subsidies per inhabitant, again, there have been, during 2013 and 2019, there have been striking differences. On average, this will be the last line in this chart, the average subsidy per inhabitant in Europe in the 16 PTAs that we have analyzed has gone down from 216 euros per year to 187 euros per year. But if you have a close look at the evolution in cities, what you see is that this trend, this reduction, is much influenced by what has happened in London, apparently, where subsidies per inhabitant have decreased from 575, which were by far the highest in the cities considered in 2013, to around 100 in 2019. In the rest of the cities, basically what you see is that in most cities, subsidies per inhabitant increase. In some cities, they stay stable, like, for example, in Amsterdam. Okay, I don't want to go too much into this. I want to finish with somehow making reference to the potential that, given the first structure that exists in many European cities, what is the potential that there could be for micro subsidies, so for a more targeted policy in terms of subsidies to public transport. Okay, and here this graph or this chart is it's a summary of what we have found in the different cities that we have analyzed, and also what we have found in the literature. Okay, and the question here is, as I say, to have a look at the first structure. So at somehow what criteria or how do fares are adapted or are different according to different features that are shown in this chart. Okay, when it comes to user group, what we see is that in most European cities there are discounts for specific groups, but with big differences in the number of groups and in the conditions that are applied to these groups in the different cities. When we talk about applying different fares, or which means also applying different subsidies according to time of the day or day of the week when public transport is used, what we see is that, to our surprise, to be very frank, this is an issue that is not widely used. And often what PTAs claim is that there is a fairness issue. The people who use public transport in peak hours are the ones that are in most need of use this public transport because they need to go to work. So somehow reducing subsidies or increasing price fares at peak hours would imply a relevant fairness or equity issue that would need to be managed. Third is whether there are differences in the fare or the subsidy structure according to space or distance. What we see mostly is that there are flat fares with zone, and that many PTAs have some skepticism on distance-based fares. Again, apparently in principle because of fairness reasons, in the sense that many less well-off users live in the outskirts of the cities. They have been kicked out of the city centers. So again, this would imply a fairness or equity issue. We don't see much discrimination in fares or subsidies according to mode of transport. Not many private operators are being or operators of other modes of transport, like as was said in micromobility modes, are being subsidized today. There are some micromobility pilots ongoing, and we want to learn more about that. But clearly, this is an issue where more can be done. There is not much differentiation of fares or of subsidies when it comes to special events or special episodes, like pollution episodes. We see that in some PTAs have special fares or special subsidies or integrated with sports. but again, not clear discounts. And finally, another issue that we think it's important is how often are these subsidies or the fares updated. And what we see is that most PTAs update the fares only once a year, according to the CPI or some sort of constant rate of increase. So somehow there is not much flexibility in the fares or in the application of the subsidies. Okay, so our interpretation of this chart that I insist is a very quick summary of what we have found out, is that clearly when we think of fare structures today, there is some differentiation, but not a lot, and that probably there is some scope. If we think that micro subsidies, so that more targeted subsidies can be a good idea, that there is scope somehow to make this fare structure more differentiated according to the different criteria that are reflected in this chart. Okay, having said this, I pass it on to Pietro, and he will present the results, as I said before, of some surveys that we have been conducting in some cities. Pietro, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mikael. So, while in the first part of this study, we've mostly talked about the current and past use of subsidies and gave a context and a background to why we need micro incentives. In the second part, we asked ourselves the question: what is the potential of micro incentives? And to answer this question, we performed a survey on a sample of over 2,000 people across Barcelona, Madrid, Oslo, Berlin, and Lisbon. For sureness, in this presentation, we will only focus on Barcelona and Madrid. And through the survey, we were able to gather insights on travel behaviors, such as motivations for owning or not owning a car, for taking or not taking public transport, and general attitudes towards micro incentives and the current use of subsidies. Finally, in the last block of the survey, we performed a stated preference study, in which we put people in two use case scenarios. The first one being a scenario in which micro incentives are implemented and integrated across public transport, shared mobility, carpooling, and all sustainable modes. And we ask people to think about the last trip that they've made by car. We give them the option to replace this car trip with an incentivized trip on a different mode in each question that we ask. And then we measured based on what their answers were and what the parameters were in place. We measured how sensitive people are to different types of incentives. The second use case scenario was we involved public transport users instead of car users like the previous one. And we tried to understand what type of incentives would be required in order for people to not travel during peak hours, but switch to off-peak travel. Now, just very quickly, some insights from the survey. When we asked people to rank from 1 to 5 how important the following reasons were for using car over public transport, we see that most people value travel time, flexibility, and comfort a lot, while for car users, cost is a little bit less important. We see it, it's the third last factor there. It is cheaper to go by car than by public transport. So we already here we can see how it is for sure difficult to make car users or private transport users in general, to make them switch to more sustainable modes. And interesting, the main difference between Barcelona and Madrid is that apparently people in Madrid are more reliant on, they find public transport more reliable than in Barcelona. Secondly, we asked public transport users who own a car why they decided to use public transport. And the main factors influencing this choice are quite different from the ones that guide car users. For one reason, cost is up there and not at the bottom, as we just saw. And secondly, lack of parking space was the main factor that we found. Finally, we also asked people who do not own a car the reason for that, and money here doesn't seem to be the issue, while the fact that people the, the absence of a need to drive a car being the main factor. And also we can see that there is a consciousness of sustainability in most of the people that we've interviewed, which is something that we were not necessarily expecting. Another question that we asked is how our respondents view change in the current fare system. We basically gave them a list of all the changes that micro incentives would imply, and we asked them to rate them from 1 to 5 how much they agreed with them. And we see that especially private motorized transport users, they agree that there should be a single card or a single platform that allows payments for all mobility services, so public, shared, and private. So this is basically mobility as a service, MaaS. And it is quite surprising that this feeling is stronger in private transport users than in public transport users, and this really shows that this type of change could have the potential to bring more people to decrease the share of public transport in favor of more sustainable modes. Then very quickly, we saw that work is the main motive for traveling by public transport, while for car trips, family is more common. That in terms of fuel cost, 2/3 paid less than 10 euros. Only 1 out of 10 had to pay tolls, and only 1/4 had to pay for parking, which is still quite low numbers. And that the average parking time is 4 hours and 30 minutes. Then just to conclude, a little sneak peek into what we were able to do with the results from the stated preference survey. As I said before, one of the use case scenarios that we took into account is the scenario in which people are able to substitute their car trip with an incentivized trip with different sustainable modes. As I said, this could be public transport, combination of public transport and shared mobility, or carpooling. And we calculated the probability of accepting this incentivized trip over the previous trip that they did. In all these scenarios, the travel time differs. And so in order to understand the findings, we divided the scenario into 3 categories. The category in which the alternative trip takes 20 minutes longer than the car trip, the scenario in which the incentivized trip takes 20 minutes less, and the scenario in which they take the same travel time. It was quite interesting to see how the trip motive has a very big influence on the willingness of people to decide to switch. The more willing people, also surprisingly, are the ones who perform the trip for work reasons. Even with the same travel time offered by the alternative mode, they will need an incentive of only 39% less of the cost of car. Also, just to be clear, the cost of car includes fuel, parking, and tolls. While for a trip that is 20 minutes faster than the car trip, they would pretty much also accept to pay the same price. The cost has to be 95% higher in order for it to be more likely. In order for it to be more likely that they choose the alternative mode. While if the motive is family, the probability of of taking the incentivized mode is actually never above 50%, and in order to pass this threshold, we need to offer people an alternative that is 20 minutes faster and that costs around half the price of what they would pay for the equivalent trip by car. Similarly, in the use case scenario of public transport users, people do need a discount on the on-peak price in order to change their travel behavior, in order to change their travel, the time they start their trip. And unsurprisingly, for a bigger change, people are willing to pay less and less, starting from 62% discount for just a 10-minute change, over to 70% discount for a 30-minute change. So in conclusion, we found that a more efficient and targeted use of subsidies could lead to a number of benefits that can be summed up into two main ones. The first one being financial gains and financial benefits for society as a whole, but also for public transport operators. And then secondly, they can really help in nudging behavior, both, as we saw, towards a higher share of sustainable modes, which in turn leads to a decrease in air pollution, congestion, and emission of greenhouse gases, or to flatten the demand curve at peak times and increase user experience during peak hours for those who cannot switch, and also achieve a higher capacity efficiency for the public transport operators. So to sum it up, the mode choice model developed from the State Preference Survey is a useful tool that should be applied on a case-by-case basis to provide prediction on the potential impact of the micro-incentive scheme. And in general, micro-incentives, we believe, can trigger a marginal yet distributed change. And especially if coupled with a well-functioning transport network, we believe they have a potential to make a big impact. This is the end of our presentation. At the end of this session, we will be staying for a Q&A. So anyone who has questions or any comments, feel free to stay and join us in the discussion. For those who have to leave, these are some contact information. So feel free to send us an email and we can be in touch. But yeah, thanks a lot for the attention, and enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Brilliant. Thank you, Miguel and Pietro, for sharing this. I mean, you talk about the fairness and the distribution, let's say, of incentives, and there are different target audiences, different needs, not easy to manage on the policy side, and then also the effectiveness of incentives. You know, I mean, does it actually work, and how can one make it work? So, a lot to discuss. As you mentioned, you will be in the Q&A booth at the end of this session. So that's where we will see you in about 40 minutes or so. Okay? Thanks a lot for joining.
Thank you.
See you later. Thank you.
Okay, so we've heard some of the big picture on this topic of incentives and pricing, and now we're going to go a little bit deeper into operational issues. So I would like to introduce our panelists for today. I am joined by Sevdalina Voinova, Director of Programs at Sofia Development Association. Hi, Sevdalina. I am joined by Ian Catlow, Head of London's European Office in Brussels. Hello, Ian. And Jan Jansen, New Mobilities Manager at Keolis. Hello, Jan.
Hello, nice to see you.
Good to see you. So, EIT Urban Mobility actually launched a poll in LinkedIn. I want to start with that. Can we just show the image? Asking the question, you know, are price incentives effective in changing citizens' mobility choices, which is just what we referred to at the end of the presentation. And 78% said yes, they can be effective. And 22% said, no, it's not enough. Something else needs to happen. It's not just about price incentives. So, can I get a quick reaction from Sevdalina first? What would you have answered to this poll?
That poll reminded me of the famous saying that chemistry is really physics, and physics is really math, and math is really difficult. So if I paraphrase it with this data, I would say incentives are really public policy, and public policy is really psychology, and psychology is really difficult. So I would say more is needed, and just to give you a little bit of flavor why I say that, in one of our incentive instruments, we still have plenty of unclaimed and unredeemed incentives. And if you're interested why, we can get into that later in the discussion.
Okay, love the answer. Thanks, Sevdelina. What about Ian? What would you have answered?
Well, I think I also would have said no. I think all our experience in London is that what counts is to have some kind of integrated approach. If you, I mean, in a complex urban transport environment, if you seek to affect the way one set of people move, you will have an impact somewhere else in the city or on some other movements. Again, we can talk later about things like our congestion charge in London, which undoubtedly were a price disincentive to use the car, and has been very effective, but only because it was accompanied by lots of other measures, in particular by providing alternatives in terms of extra bus services and making it easier to walk and cycle. So yeah, on its own, changing prices, in my view, doesn't achieve much.
Okay, not a standalone. Thanks, Ian. What about Jan? What would you have answered?
Yeah, this is very interesting. We have invented something called cost and convenience, and these are kind of versus each other. And normally I would say cost is short term. You will have an effect short term doing this subsidizing short term with cost, lowering the cost. But the convenience will be the endurant one. If it's not convenient, you will not use it long term. So I think convenience is extremely important. Whatever you can do is to go deep and do something good at one small limited site, and then you can scale it up. I think that's a way to introduce these services.
Okay, so cost can be a trigger to maybe sort of discover something or see if something works, but in the end, it needs to be convenient for you and in the way you see your life. Okay, brilliant. So before we go a bit deeper into this topic, I think it's also useful to get a sense of where you're coming from, the general perspective on this. We have two cities, we have a mobility company. So can we first go to Sofia? Sevdelina, can you tell us a little bit about how you apprehend these issues of pricing and incentives in your context?
Absolutely. Let me briefly tell you about Sofia, so you know where I come from. It's a relatively big city. I think it's the 50th biggest in the European Union. It has a population of 1.3 million, and relatively big urbanized territory. And in terms of economy, you can see these numbers on the next slide. And in terms of economy, the GDP per capita is approximately 25,000 euro, which is slightly over 90% of the EU average. It's been growing fast. At the rate of growth is 6% per year, which is for the last 10 years, which is really significant compared with the average 3% for the rest of the country. In terms of car ownership, currently there are approximately 820,000 registered cars in Sofia. And actually the trend is that the number of registered cars is going down. But at a very low rate, approximately 4,000 cars less every next year. But still, it's a positive trend. And now, so imagine, so this is a relatively big city, relatively like mid in terms of economic background and income. And now, as for the cars, 800,000, but with adding the commuters, it means that at every moment in Sofia, there is one private car per every inhabitant, which makes it a very busy traffic-wise. And finally, let's imagine the system of public transport. It consists of 4 modes of transport: metro, trolley buses, trams, and buses, and they're operated by 3 municipally owned companies. There is a very small share of privately operated bus lines, And all of micromobility, bike sharing, car sharing, e-scooters, they're also private operated. A little bit more about the public transport. You can actually see the charts on the next slide, the model split. And in terms of money, this year's budget of Sofia is a little bit over 1 billion euro, out of which, of the entire budget of the city, 20% goes for public transport. Or if we take out of the entire city budget only our own city income and not transfers from the national budget or from the EU budget, 36% of our own budget goes for public transport. This is huge. That is probably the biggest item in our municipal budget. You can quickly have a look at the model split. It's in Bulgarian, but it's pretty simple. The blue in the pie chart is public transport, and the orange is private cars. And you can see that it is more or less the same. The difference is very insignificant. And the next big portion is actually walking. And in the other chart, you can see some dynamics. And you can, again, the first group of columns are public transport, the second is private cars, and the third is walking. And you can basically see that the habits, the behavioral change that occurred during COVID is not recovered yet. That there are still the use of public transport cannot go to where it used to be before COVID. And finally, to get the perspective when we talk about incentives, a couple of things I've put on the next slide regarding the role of public transportation as we see it from the city perspective, from the municipal perspective. What is the role of public transport in terms of urban development? It does have an economic role, of course, because it provides access to jobs, to education, to services. It does, however, have a very serious social role. Actually, it is a very socially embedded system. And I was very interested to hear in the Factual survey we were presented a little bit earlier that they juxtaposed efficiency versus fairness. But from a city point of view, really a balance has to be drawn between those, and we cannot afford to be unfair. Because that's the social role. No one's left behind. This is the egalitarian role of public transport, overcoming disparities and particularly overcoming transport dependency. It also has the role of reaching territorial balance and connectivity and not allowing formation of ghettos or of isolated areas within the city. It has huge impact on health and well-being, not only with access to health services and recreation, but also with noise, pollution, stress. And finally, it's a major driver for mitigation climate change, since 30% of the carbon dioxide footprint comes from transport. So these are some of the major roles that transport has to fulfill within city development. And briefly said, the strategic objective, developing public transport and urban mobility, more generally speaking, is the so-called triple transition. It has to be in line with the digitalization. It has to be social or just or fair, and no one should be left behind. And it has to be green and sustainable. So to sum it up, these are multiple objectives, and this multiplicity of objectives absolutely results in very complicated system of pricing and incentives. And when we get to that, just keep in mind that it's always difficult, it's always checks and balances from a city point of view, how to develop those, and to at the same time check that they're digital, social, and green. That's
brilliant. Thank you, Sevdelina. So it's complex. A lot of objectives can go into this pricing policy, but at the same time, you have a sizable challenge in Bulgaria because essentially there is one car per inhabitant, and this is a core sort of starting point for you when you're considering also other mobility options. Thanks a lot for this. We'll go deeper into this discussion, but let's head off to London. First, to also hear a little bit about your perspective on pricing and incentives in your context in London. Ian.
Thank you very much. So yes, let me just say a little bit about the London context. And of course, we're a city nowadays of something like 9 million people. And that compares, with 20 years ago when we were only around 7.2, 7.3 million people. So we've grown a lot in terms of population over the past few years. And that's reflected a lot of effort that we put into making the transport system still work efficiently. So if we just move on to the next slide. In London, we have an integrated transport body, Transport for London, which is responsible to the mayor, who you can see there, Sadiq Khan. And it's responsible for pretty much all the modes of transport. So we run the London Underground system ourselves. We contract out the 9,000 buses in London to several different operators. We run a light railway in the Docklands to the east of the city, and a tram system to the south. We're responsible for all the main roads in London. The 33 local boroughs, communes in London look after the local roads. We also license all the taxis and the private hire vehicles, so including Uber and its competitors, and we license river services. And we also promote walking and cycling. We have our own cycle hire scheme with more than 12,000 bikes across London. We operate the congestion charge, which I mentioned earlier, which is in the very centre of the city. You can see maybe possibly on the slide there on the map in the shaded area right in the centre is where the congestion charge operates. We also operate a low emission zone for heavy vehicles and an ultra low emission zone with slightly tighter standards for all other vehicles, so including passenger cars. That currently operates in inner London, but will be extended to the rest of London in the summer. The main exceptions to our control of the network are the motorways, part of the national road network, which tend to sort of finish as they get with a few kilometres inside London's boundary, and also the main rail commuter lines. We control the rail services which are purely within London's boundaries, but the main commuter lines from outside London, which come into the centre of the city, they're part of the national rail network. So just moving to the next slide. One of Transport for London's main responsibilities is to implement the Mayor's transport strategy. So this is a legal requirement that applies to the Mayor and is subject to consultation with the London boroughs, with stakeholders, and with Londoners themselves. Now, a number of principles underpin that strategy. So firstly, healthy streets, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment on the next slide. But also we want to make the entire transport network easy to use in active modes, so walking and cycling. It has to be inclusive and available to everybody, and of course it has to be safe and accessible, no matter what your circumstances are. We need to make efficient use of the street network. As I said, there's a lot of pressure on the infrastructure because of the growth in population. So the efficiency by using technology or innovation to make transport better, then we need to focus on that. And of course, we have to improve the air quality, which is still responsible for serious health effects in London. And we have to combat the effects of climate change. And we have a target of 2030 for being a net zero carbon city. Just turning that into more concrete objectives, we want to ensure that by 2041, at least 80% of all trips in London are made by public transport or by walking or cycling. That compares with around 64% now. And, we have a sort of an explicit health objective in the strategy as well. We want everybody to have at least 20 minutes active travel per day. And we believe that by designing a transport system in the right way, we can make it easy for people to get that activity. And all this also means that we need to reduce traffic by 10 to 15% by 2041 as well. And that means behaviour change by all users, really, whether it's individual citizens or businesses or anybody else. We need to see changes in the way that people move around the city. I should just say one more word about the safety of the system. Again, we are responsible for road safety as well. We have a Vision Zero objective there, meaning that again by 2041 we don't want anybody to be killed or seriously injured on London's road network. And again, that's a strategy which has to be implemented across the transport network, and which we take extremely seriously. So just finally on the next slide, I mentioned this principle of healthy streets. This is a concept which has been developed by Lucy Saunders, a consultant who we've worked with over several years now. And if you can imagine the way you operate and design a high street in a city, and in London in some respects is at least 33 cities all put together in one bigger area. They all have high streets. Some of them have several high streets, and which are the focus of social and economic activity. And we believe that if we design these in the right way and operate them in the right way, then this can have a major impact on the way the city works. And Lucy has set out these sort of 10 principles that are shown there in the graphic as to what a street should look like to be healthy. So I mean, it should attract pedestrians from all walks of life. The roads should be easy to cross. There should be shade and shelter from bad weather. There should be places to stop and wait if necessary. It shouldn't be too noisy. It should in particular be easy to get there and move around that area by using public transport, by walking and cycling. And people should feel safe and occupied, or there should be things to do, and they should feel relaxed. And of course the air should be clean. And if you try to actually apply those principles to all the streets in the city, then you have no choice but to adopt some kind of integrated approach and to come up with a much more environmentally friendly and effective and also economically beneficial transport system as a whole. So those are the kind of main principles that we're working to.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Ian, for that overview. So integrated system and also a more general policy to create streets that are comfortable to be mobile in, also for walking and to reduce congestion. So how can also the pricing system and incentives help get more people onto the streets in addition to making them attractive and comfortable? So we'll get into that. Jan, you're providing a service to cities.
Yes, we are. But I will actually. I will. Could you put on the PowerPoints? Do you think? There we are. Perfect. I will actually start with autonomous vehicles because this is very interesting when cutting costs. So they have been there now for a while, 5-6 years or something like that, and we have been operating in worldwide, basically, in Scandinavia, in Europe, in UK, also in the States, in France, of course, and also in Australia. And this is autonomous vehicles. As a public transport operator, Keolis is operating worldwide and do findings in some countries. And in Australia, this is a little bit silly because I'm sitting in Sweden and I will talk about Australia. Australia is as far as you can go from Sweden, probably. So, but we have had a test with DRT, or on-demand solutions, in Australia. And I will talk a little bit about that, because if you combine autonomous vehicles with a DRT solutions, I think that will give a lot to the public transport and to transfer a lot of private car owners into public transport. So basically, taking the driver away, which will happen with the second generation of autonomous vehicles, which are already now running in Silicon Valley in US, for instance. You will cut like 50% of the cost of the calculation of the bus calculation, and that is immense amount, actually. So Looking at the figures we had before with subsidizing, public transport could be a winning opportunity in the future, actually. Okay, 50% might not occur, but still it's very interesting. Okay, next one. So this is New South Wales, and there is, of course, a PTA, public transport operator authority there, and that is Transport for New South Wales. This is very interesting because they combine a lot of different entities. These entities like Transport Agency, Administration, City Traffic Office, Public Transport Authority are different entities in like Sweden, and in Australia and New South Wales, these are combined in one entity. This makes things very easy to launch things, having new ideas, because the legal things, the discussion, the practicalities, all these things will happen if you have the right context, of course, and if it's driven by the authority, then things will happen rather fast, actually. The subsidizing is actually that this is the normal monthly card you have for public transport. You can pay for a certain trip in one app if you want to. So it's the same cost as you normally have in the system running a normal public transport. This has been working rather well. I wouldn't say it hasn't totally changed from owning private cars. It has probably taken away a number 2 car or something like that. This was a manned operation, as you can see. There's one of our drivers there standing with his car, Louisa. Next one, please. Transferring this into, there are bottlenecks, of course, and biggest bottlenecks are norms. You do what you know, and typical example is like downloading an app, a traveler's app from a public transport authority is rather easy. You do that in like 10-15 seconds or something like that. But changing the total behavior of starting using that one to use some kind of on-demand service, that takes a lot, and therefore I think it's very, very important with visuality, that you start in a certain community, very limited community. You do it really, really good, and then people start to talk about it and with neighbors and things like that, and then this could actually be scaled into bigger environments. So I mentioned before discussing that this is cost and convenience, and it seems like when I was younger, I think it was more on the cost side. Today, using a private car, for instance, is a lot of convenience in it, but we have to be as good as the private car. So that is our challenge for this one. Okay, we'll take the next one. Norms. I spoke. Sorry, that was not norms. You should try to build in areas where public transport is fully accepted. Don't start in an area where people are not used to public transport. They should have some kind of behavior and the positive ideas about public transport. Otherwise, it will not be a success. You need to be very endurant. And it needs some time to be accepted. We are talking about probably more than 1 year, 1 to 2 years or something like that. Don't do it for some months. That will not work at all. Visuality, as said before, is very important, and also you need to adapt frequency, number of vehicles, how often could I be there? Is it 5 minutes if you have an on-demand solution? Is it 6 minutes? What is good enough? And this differs from neighborhoods to neighborhoods a lot. And then the cost, you can play around with the cost, but it should be probably the same as normal public transport. I spoke about the cost and convenience before, so we heard that one. And you normally say that healthcare is a human right, but we believe that mobility is a human right as well. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant, Jan. Thanks a lot. And some of these images are not necessarily what people have in mind when they think of public transport. So it'll be interesting also to see your view on some of those developments. But I'd like to kick off quickly with actually a question from the audience that I think is really spot on, because we're looking at all of these incentives and we see that it's quite complex. They need to be highly adapted and tailor-made, and they need to fit different audiences, different types of needs. So how are they actually designed and organized in practice? Because on the other hand, shouldn't we be looking at fare structures that are simple and easy to understand? And so if we have micro incentives all over the place, isn't it just going to get really complex? So I'd like to get a reaction from you. Sevdelina first, and then Ian as well.
It should be easy and predictable, and at the same time, it should allow for surprises and dynamics. Because what we have is, for example, we have so-called traditional incentives, and this is predominantly pricing and tariff policy. And our tariff policy is particularly focused on specific socio-demographic groups. So we have special pricing policy, heavily deducted and subsidized for students, for kids, for young people younger than 26, and for seniors. Also special fares for families, and thousands of passengers actually use those. Probably one of the new developments from a couple of years ago is that an annual public transport bus was introduced, which is very simple. It's 365 lever for the entire public transport system for the entire year. Ever since it was introduced, because it's so easy and so predictable and just conveys the message in such a clear way, the amount of annual public transport buses increased by 41% almost overnight, within a week. So sometimes very simple instruments and very predictable and very easy are very easy to convey and to actually adopt by the audience. However, I mentioned our subsidized public transport groups, and they've been like this forever. I mean, probably for the last 30 years, these are the groups that have been heavily subsidized with special fares. By now, they are seen like set in stone. They are seen that Ian said mobility is a human right, but it seems by now, for over 30 years, that with these subsidies in place, that they're seen as human right. So subsidy is a human right. Even when Sofia tried to reduce a little bit some of these subsidies, as discussed in the survey in the beginning, particularly in peak hours and in the most intense, traffic intense hours, it wasn't accepted well. So one of the lessons learned is that we do have to rethink subsidies, but we have to keep the system somehow in progress, and we have to convey the message that this is a developing system and nothing is set in stone, including this makes it much more difficult now to combine the traditional forms of pricing and tariff policy with the new ones, and we do develop new ones. So the differences and probably the major drawbacks is that the traditional pricing incentives they reach enormous number of people, and they're very visible and they are efficient. But the problem with them is, first of all, that they're very costly and take a lot of public funds. Secondly, they're difficult to develop. And thirdly, they actually target people who are already using public transport. So the new incentives actually are trying to focus on those that are likely to switch from single occupancy vehicle to public transport. And they have to offer different services. And we do offer different services, particularly integration with last mile or first mile travel, or bigger travel options with on-demand public transport, which we introduced, or only travel planning with zero emissions. But the probably, if I could say one thing out of all the conclusions regarding these newly developed incentive models, we are trying to reach the so-called early adopters. We're trying to reach people and early followers. We're trying to reach and specifically target groups of people that are likely to do something that is meaningful to them personally, something that is enjoyable, because they would engage with such behavior. So,
and they would be able to understand this flexible nature of different types of incentives, because they'd be looking for a trigger, a support.
Exactly. They'll be looking for, and it's also a matter of self-image. It's how I see myself as contributing to something bigger than myself. And external rewards are not always the ones that trigger people to do something meaningful. That's why we do have incentives that are not claimed yet, because people are looking for other types of incentives. Actually, when we are developing such incentives, very, very targeted, I was surprised to discover that most of the groups that we are targeting actually said that they don't want incentives that could be considered commercial. They wouldn't like to be rewarded with a voucher or with a discount for a purchase. They would like to be rewarded with something different, with an experience, or with something that actually promotes their self-image. And let me give you one example. One of the specific groups that we are targeting now are pet lovers, and they're a big army. I mean, practically most of 50% of the households in Sofia own a pet. So a lot of these people actually would do a lot in terms of mobility to support the cause of animals and animal protection. So a lot of them are actually switching or ready to switch and to make a sacrifice in order to claim some points in order for them to be used for animal shelters. So you actually support mobility with other types of causes, not necessarily 100% linked to mobility per se or to ecology.
Okay,
and that's very interesting.
Because time is really, really running with the different presentations. So I just want to go quickly to Ian as well to understand, his perspective as he was talking about the integrated system. How do you deal with that on the one hand, and highly targeted, flexible incentives on another?
Okay, well, I mean, maybe the first thing to say is that clearly price and price incentives have a role to play in the overall mix, but they're not, as I also said, perhaps the key point. I mean, if we look at the work done by UITP, the Global Public Transport Association, which has looked into the effect of pricing on use of public transport, the conclusions they've drawn quite rightly in our experience really is that value for money is something that people will always mention, cost, overall cost and value for money, but when you actually analyze this much further, and I think this was to some extent brought out in the survey results that we saw at the beginning of the session, that there are other things: reliability, punctuality, frequency, the overall convenience and comfort and security, geographical coverage. Can I get actually to where I need to get to? Can I do that at a reasonable cost in a reasonable time? And how does that fit with my travel patterns? Actually, all of those things play a role as well in decision making, and some of them are quite often, in our experience, much more important. It's about comfort and security and convenience. Now, there are also other things which make it easier to encourage behaviour change and get people to do different things, and in particular to move away from private vehicles and onto the public transport system or walking and cycling. One of those, of course, is information. Now, in London, we've always pursued an open data policy. So we have live information which can be used by any developer who wants to about all the movements on our transport system. And this, of course, is powering all sorts of apps that people can download and use on their phone. So they get live information. They know exactly what's happening across the transport system, and they can make rational decisions based on that. So you have to inform people. But also, when it comes to accessing the system, as was also mentioned before, the sort of the fare structure and the ticketing systems can also actually be a disincentive. If you're not used to using the system, you're sort of frightened about how you're actually going to get there if you suddenly decide to use the bus or the metro or whatever. Now, we've tried to take all the paying out of that. First of all, we have the Oyster card, which has now been running for more than 20 years and can be used across our network, and basically you have to load that up with money before you can use the system. But now even more convenient over the last few years is that you can use contactless bank cards on London's system. So if you have a bank card, most of them these days do have a contactless facility, and you can just access our system automatically. You don't need to think about what kind of price of ticket you need or go through any other formalities. You just turn up and wave your bank card at the reader, and it will let you onto the system. And in addition to that, we have daily and weekly capping. So we automatically work out what is the cheapest fare for you at the end of the day or at the end of the week based on your travel pattern. So you don't need to think about what ticket you need or how much it is, because we will work out the cheapest fare for you in retrospect in any case. So all of these things make behaviour change possible. And certainly when we were working with our partners on the railways, on the national rail system, wanting them to use contactless bank cards in their services in London, then this was quite a negotiation. But in the end, they agreed, and they very quickly saw an increase of ridership with people using contactless bank cards, because people had no longer had a barrier to getting onto the system. But very quickly on the actual pricing, then of course in terms of disincentives to use the car, I mentioned the congestion charge, and that certainly has had an impact in central London, and also but because people have shifted to using buses or walking or cycling, all of which have increased their activity over the last 20 years or so. But also our low emission zone and our ultra low emission zone are also charging systems. They're not bans, they're charging systems. So again, they're meant to encourage a different behaviour, but you still can drive if you really have to.
Okay, brilliant, Ian. And Jan, you wanted to react, and in fact, I'm afraid it will be our last reaction on this topic. I mean, it's so broad, and I'm afraid time has been flying. But Jan, your reaction as well.
I have a short comment, and that is decrease the number of parking lots, because that is totally, if it's very complex to park a car in a city, you will definitely transfer into public transport. We are in some projects with new neighborhoods in Sweden, and moving into these new neighborhoods, there is only 0.2 parkings per household. That's pretty low. So then you will take a decision not to own a private car, and in the vicinity to these new neighborhoods, there are mobility houses building up, which is basically mobility hubs, but with some services and things like that. So we are using, people are get used to not having a car, but still have the mobility. And they will have a transfer to mass transit and things like that very close as well. So I think that's the way to do it. You can do it for new neighborhoods, but also, I mean, decreasing number of parking lots and building complexity into cities is a way to do it. I would never drive a car in Paris or London for sure, because it's too complex for me, I think. So, okay.
Okay, brilliant. So tapping into the early adopters, but not necessarily with mobility incentives, also other kind of causes that they might wire into. The ease of access and the convenience to the whole pricing system and structure of public transport with contactless payments and adapted payments. And then, thinking about just generally reducing parking spaces as a key reason and disincentive not to use a car and maybe to look at public transport. Sevdelina, Ian, Jan, thanks a lot for your great preparation, the perspective that you've given us. I'm afraid time really flew, but we can continue the discussion in the Q&A booth right now. Thank you so much for having joined us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I said, we will, as soon as we finish with the conclusions, we will go into the Q&A booth. We'll be able to speak with our two presenters of the study and ask extra questions on that. And for those who are interested in this topic, we can continue the discussion. But I would like then to introduce Anders Bengtsson. He is Head of Innovation Hub North at EIT Urban Mobility, and he will have the difficult task of wrapping up this conversation and giving us the conclusion. Anders, over to you.
Yeah, okay, so conclusions. I think all of us have great conclusions after this. And I scribbled down a lot of things that I need to decipher sometime. I don't know in the future. They're great things. So, first of all, thank you all speakers and for sharing insights and experiences. I mean, Miguel, Pietro, Sevdalina, Ian, and Jan. I mean, this was a very interesting thing to listen into. I have some great headlines, I'd say. Pedestrians on wheels, for example, digital, social, and green, convenience and cost, easy, predictable, but also surprises and dynamics. And as you said, Jean Paul, the topic is broad, time is flying, so we need to act now, I say. Well, a developed public transport, including new types of vehicles and models, is, I think, key in the transitional change that is needed. But in order to get the full effect, of course, an increased accessibility or equity that Miguel was mentioning in the study needs to be in place. But also, of course, an increased use of the public transport must be in place. And John was talking about conveniency. I mean, it seems like he has the possibility to manage the cost. Now he wants the conveniency. And Sevdalin was talking about early adopters, and Pietro gave us an insights on the trip motives. But so, yeah, maybe technology and human behavior need to go hand in hand, not least. And therefore, I think that the citizen engagement and behavioral change, as Ian and John was mentioning a lot, have a large focus, of course, also within the things that the EIT Urban Mobility are trying to do in its city development activities. And I can also say that in a recently inaugurated collaboration between the urban mobility, EIT Urban Mobility, and the four mission cities of Helsingborg, Lund, Malmö, and Copenhagen, it was pointed out that the combination of public transport and behavioral change will have a large impact on the success of actually getting climate neutral in 2030. So yeah, very interesting. And I mean, to give some time for the Q&As, I just want to end with that if you want to learn more about public transport and happen to be at the Global Public Transport Summit in Barcelona this year, please listen in to EIT Urban Mobility's CEO, Maria Savachidis. She will be speaking on the topic of big and beautiful. Well, can large entities lead innovation within public transport? And that is on the 5th of June at 12 o'clock. So thank you again. I just want to say to speakers, producers, and not least all of you in the audience listening. Thank you.